Let's talk for a little bit about the 80-20 rule, right? The 80-20 rule, which kind of originally started off being thought of and talked about by this guy named Vilfredo Pareto, and he came up with the Pareto principle. And the Pareto principle is something that he started to talk about and publish and write about around 1906. And the general notion of the Pareto principle is that 80% of the land in Italy seemed to be owned by 20% of the people. Right? So 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people. And then what he started to do is he started to see if that ratio, that 80-20 ratio, would correlate to other things in the world. And one of the other things in the world that he discovered was that 80% of, well, you know what, let's do that. Let's do that in a different color. 80% of the peas in his garden came from 20% of the pods in his garden. And the more he looked around, the more he discovered that the 80-20 rule seemed to hold true for all sorts of things. The big one in business that we tend to look at, the really important thing about the 80-20 rule in business is that, 80% of our profits come from 20% of our customers. 80% of our complaints come from 20% of our customers. Right? 80% of our sales come from 20% of our customers, or no, 80% of our sales come from 20% of our sales staff, right? And so on and so forth. And wherever you look, you can find all sorts of really interesting information. I was looking up some of this stuff preparing for this video today, and I came up with some kind of interesting stats from just about 1990, I think 1989, world gross domestic product, world GDP. And so if you look at the richest 20% of the, that's a terrible percentage sign. The richest 20% make up, as of 1999, 82% of the population. The second richest 20% make up about 11.7%, and so on and so forth, and then 2%, and then another 2 for the fourth 20%, and then another 2, and then like 1.5% for the last, right? But again, we look at this even, so it was true in 1908 when dude first figured it out, and it was true in 1989 when it was most recently applied to the world GDP numbers, is 80% of the wealth is controlled by 20% of the people. Where does that start to make sense in business for us, or where does that start to matter in business for us? It matters in business for us at this part that I've put right in the middle, which is right here, is that 80% of our effort comes from 20% of our work. I painted my way through college, and my painter boss, Bucky, he used to say to me, you do good work, Will, but you just don't do much of it. And that was true, but the work that I did was really, really good. I was real good at painting painting around the edges of things, and I didn't have to do a bunch of taping, and so I was very efficient. I was really good, and so I earned more money, and Bucky got a lot more painting done out of me than he would get out of his other guys who would have to tape and prep and do all that stuff. I could just paint really well, and so 80% of his result came from 20% of his payroll cost because he was paying me the same thing as everybody else. I just did a lot better work, and so again, 80% of his productivity came from 20% of his painting staff. So that worked out that way, and even Bucky the painter was able to apply the Pareto principle or the 80-20 rule to his business and make a go of it. So the trick here in the Pareto rule, the big question here, and the question that I started asking the first time I learned about the 80-20 rule, is if 80% of my work only gets me 20% of my results, why do the 80%? Right? Why do the 80%? If I have days in a week, right? If I've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I've got 5 days in a week, each day representing, you guessed it, 20% of my week. Why can't I just figure out which of these days are going to get me the 80%, which in school would be a B, right? Why can't I figure out which of these days, let's say that I am going to get 80% of my results from a Tuesday, right? And Tuesday is my 80% day. And then the other days are going to get me a total of 20, which means this is basically a 5% day, and this is a 5% day, this is a 5% day, and this is a 5% day. If each of these days get me 5%, why don't I just not go to work those days? Why don't I just blow those days off, right? If I can hit it out of the park on Tuesdays and do 80% of my work on Tuesday, do I even need to show up these other days? Is my boss really going to care if I'm getting 80% of the results on those days? And if that's true, couldn't I turn all of these other days also into 80% days? Right? Right? Couldn't I turn all of these other days into 80% days as well and hit those days out of the park if I could just figure out how to not do the 20% days? And if that was the case, couldn't I then have 5 jobs and get 5 jobs done in the same amount of time as most people are getting 1 job done? And if I was able to get 5 jobs done and do a B, a good solid B, 80% of the things my boss wanted me to do, I can get done in a week, that's pretty good. That's pretty good, and that's well above average, I would imagine, in terms of employer, in terms of employee productivity. I think I could do pretty good. If I can get 5 jobs done in 1 week, couldn't I have 5 full-time jobs? And wouldn't that mean my earning power would be 5 times average, right? And so let's say my average job is $50,000 a year, $50,000, right? If my 1 job equals $50,000, 50,000 times 5, as we know, is $250, right? So if I'm able to figure out this 80-20 stuff and figure out ways to apply the 80-20 stuff to my life, if I'm able to figure out where the 20% of the effort is going to get me 80% of my profit, where the 20% of my customers are going to cause me 80% of my complaints, where 20% of my sales staff is going to get me 80% of my sales, if I can figure all of those things out, doesn't life start to get very interesting and very exciting? Now, this is the end of the first part of the 5-part 80-20 rule series. So I'm going to do 5 videos on the 80-20 rule. And then at the end of the thing, maybe you can look at all 5 of these videos and you can come back to me and tell me which one was the one that got you 80% of your results.